Welcome back to Poli-Sci 110. We will move on from our last lecture where we examined the factors that determine how senators vote on justices. Here we will move on to the question of how much do parties and ideology truly affect the Supreme Court's decisions? I'm going to outline 4 different misconceptions regarding the US Supreme Court. Many people tend to assume that justices, once conservative or liberal, always remain that way, and that decisions are entirely determined by a justice's ideology or partisanship. But that is not necessarily the case. The first misperception is that justices remain ideologically the same throughout their career, but empirical evidence shows that this is actually not the case. If we examine how liberal or conservative different justices of the Supreme Court are over time, and if we were to plot them out on this liberal to conservative scale, with conservative being higher values and liberal being lower values, we find that justices actually do in fact change their positions often in relation to the decisions that they choose. This particular justice on the bottom in blue is Justice William Douglas. And the justice at the top, I believe, is Clarence Thomas in light blue. These scores are known as Martin-Quinn scores. They were named after 2 political scientists who developed a way to measure the ideology of justices over time and for every session in a consistent manner. Now, if we were to put all of these changes onto a chart without the animation, and if we were to put the names of the justices next to each other, then we have a better idea of who is conservative and who is liberal on the court. The black line represents the Chief Justice. So the Chief Justice from Earl Warren, Warren Burger, Rehnquist to John Roberts, our current Chief Justice, that line has changed, and individual justices have become either more liberal or conservative. One leading example of this was David Souter, who retired from the court during Obama's second term, or actually during his first term, sorry. He was nominated to the court by President George H.W. Bush in 1991. People thought that he would be generally conservative, but he became more liberal over time on the court. And this also means that the Supreme Court itself has changed on average in terms of how liberal or conservative it is. So here the black line represents the median justice. We have a red line for Chief Justice Roberts, along with the most conservative and most liberal justices as well. And so there often is a different swing vote on the Supreme Court depending on the issue at hand. It is not always the case that judges who begin as conservatives or liberals remain as such after 5 or 10 years on the court. A second misperception regarding the US Supreme Court is that conservative justices and liberal justices always vote together as blocs or consistently. This is actually not the case. If we were to look at the degree of similarity, that is, how often each justice agrees with the other justice, it's actually pretty common for many justices to agree with each other on case decisions. So for example, if we look at Clarence Thomas, often regarded as a very conservative justice, and compare Clarence Thomas to Justice Sotomayor, then we find that the 2 justices actually agree usually about 71% of the time. Now, there is some ideological agreement. We do find, for example, that liberals on the court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, Stephen Breyer, that they tend to agree more often, but so do the conservatives on the court. Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Antonin Scalia, or John Roberts. However, even justices who are not traditionally considered liberal, justices who are traditionally considered liberals still tend to agree most of the time with the conservative justices and vice versa. Why do we have, or why does it seem that the Supreme Court is very divisive? It's because the cases that we hear about are often the ones that involve the ideological divides. Whenever the Supreme Court issues a decision that is 9-0 or 8-1 or 7-2, we may not hear about it. But in fact, there are many cases where all of the justices agree with each other, or perhaps not many, but it's not uncommon. A third misconception regarding the Supreme Court is that Antonin Scalia, who made the news a few years ago, is the most, or was the most conservative justice ever. But that's actually not the case. We find that in the modern context, Clarence Thomas tends to be the most conservative justice. Other conservative justices include Alito and John Roberts as well. We are still developing information about how conservative or liberal the new justices of the court may be. These include Brett Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Amy Coney Barrett. And a fourth misconception regarding the Supreme Court is that President Obama appointed a bunch of left-wing activists to the court. That is actually not the case. If we were to look at those ideology scores and compare them to various justices or to the president himself, we found that, and again, I'm speaking on behalf of political scientists, that the justices whom President Obama nominated tended to be liberal, but slightly less liberal than he is personally as well. Sometimes presidents can't get all that they want because the Senate has to approve their nominees. And a final misconception regarding the court is that presidents do not submit nominations or get confirmation votes in their last year. This is mostly wrong. This was a big deal during the last year of Obama's presidency in 2016. Antonin Scalia passed away, and the president nominated Merrick Garland to take his place. The Senate, which had a Republican majority at the time, did not conduct hearings on Merrick Garland's nomination and ultimately did not confirm a justice. The majority leader at the time, Mitch McConnell, argued that the American people will make their decisions during the election in November of 2016, and that will signal the kind of justice that they want on the court. Historically, however, most of the time presidents have submitted nominations and have received confirmation votes during their last years in office. However, it's still the case that the president and the Senate, a majority of the Senate, 51 voters or members, have to agree. And so if there's not an agreement there, then there will not be a confirmation. Thank you.